The first thing is being an accompanist. Now, most pianists are just solo heroes. They're just, there's just a lot of people just play solo repertoire. I feel like this sort of that's like something that they would have done a lot in the 19th century, in the 18th century. That was like part of being a pianist, part of that whole. So, what insights can you have you gained from doing that that has informed just piano playing in general and everything, looking at the repertoire and just the way accompanying a voice? What are some nice insights from that?
Um, Absolutely, just the need to keep going and support what is going on around you, which is really something that Partimento study helps with. Let's say you have to play in someone's lesson and it's a Handel Rage aria that is extremely technical and it's not realistic for you to sight read that note for note, but if you recognize the schemata, if you know your rule of the octave, if you see what's happening given the bass line, even if it's an obbligato aria and it's not, he doesn't just give you continuo as he does sometimes, you can create something that's supportive enough to the singer that the lesson can still happen.
Hmm.
And then it's a much more successful musical experience for both of you. And then obviously Partimento training informs improvisation like cadenzas, Eingänge, things like that, where you're expected to improvise in a concerto. Or if there's a situation where you and your partner get off. I once accompanied an audition where the singer jumped 2 lines in her Mozart aria, and I was effectively sight reading, and I had to find her and sound musically plausible while I was finding her.
Yeah.
And stuff like this happens all the time. And I find a lot of piano students who don't grow up with Partimento and improvisation are just trained to follow what's on the page, or there may be other sociological reasons for that where they're taught to obey everyone around them. But Partimento study and schema study and accompanying will teach you it's okay. You don't have to do what's on the page all the time. You can't when it's an orchestra reduction. That's why
Yeah.
I have my accessible accompaniments, the playable aria reductions. They're sort of ready-made for sight reading situations. I had to play the Schumann Opus 73, so it's the Fantasiestücke. I had the kind of rare opportunity to play the complete set with a clarinetist for a church that I play services with frequently, and they really appreciate high quality music, so they got a clarinetist who had subbed with the Cleveland Orchestra, and we performed these together. And there was a little arpeggio passage in the last movement where it was just way too big for my hand. I do have a very small hand, and so I had no hesitation about just revoicing that. And because I know Partimento, I know counterpoint, I know what, how these lines are functioning. So I revoiced it in a way that would fit my hand without sounding like a clunky mess. And keeping in mind what the clarinet was doing and how the lines were all interacting, went over perfectly. I mean, certainly people at a church gig, I'm not sure how many of them even know who Schumann was, but musically it was completely intact. And I don't think a pianist who is trained to follow everything that's on the page would necessarily have thought of that option. They would probably be drilling this passage that didn't fit their hand from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. and maybe calls the cops on them. And now in a competition situation, you are often stuck with judges who are going to say, why didn't you play exactly what was on the page? But I think it's because those judges aren't necessarily all trained in this stuff.
Yeah,
But
so that's I have a question about that, which is do you is it are people is this pressure more on the singer or the accompanist, or really it's a tag team, both it's equal pressure for both people? Like if you don't play exactly the same thing, is it okay? Is it so stressful?
I think it's much easier to sell that in the collaborative literature than in the solo literature, because it really is like you, 2 or 3 or 4 people, or however many people are coming together to form a product or to form a whole. And so, it's hard to say because I turned to collaborative arts, when I started PhD theory coursework at Indiana, I was kind of looking for a way to keep making music, and I no longer had an ensemble requirement to be in choir. And then the non-major voice TAs sort of snapped me up. So I pretty much made a pretty clean break from focusing on solo repertoire. And so there was a lot of this, yeah, you need to kind of rework the accompaniments on the fly, because a lot of them were singing musical theater and pop where it's like they'll
Mm.
duplicate the vocal line in the piano part, and that's not what you should be playing.
Just the
Um,
harmony. Okay.
so I was in these situations where I had to kind of change things on the fly, and it's just like being a continual player,
Right. Now,
you know.
Nicole, are you ever in this situation? Now, I'm not. You have much more experience with this with me, but do you if you're accompanying a lesson, do you have to ever deal with a character like this? You know, like who's just kind of a singing teacher who's going crazy and very. This is from Citizen Kane, but I was just thinking, and then is like, do you have to deal with pretty crazy singing teachers who are kind of over the top?
Oh goodness, I mean, yes, I'd say a lot of singing teachers are over the top. It's always been in a good way.
Yeah.
Um, just I've had the great privilege of working with some incredibly famous and effective voice professors. Of course, that IU is world famous for its opera program, and justifiably so. And so one of my favorite people I've worked with long term was Wolfgang Brendel. He's a Wagnerian baritone, teaches a
Mm.
lot of baritones. So I played a lot of that literature. I mean, he is hilarious, and his way of teaching German diction was telling the singer what sort of silly or potentially dirty thing they accidentally said in German because their vowel wasn't quite right.
Oh.
And I mean, we would just be like, just falling over laughing, and that corrected their diction very quickly.
Right.
Or
You knew what they were actually saying.
Carol Vaness might join you in a duet from Rigoletto, and she can still bust out those high C's as Gilda, and and her little dog is trying to get up in my lap at the piano. She's got this little like rat terrier, and just so much fun. Such great characters. I mean,
I think that's what's missing from like most pianists, because most pianists are in their own bubble and they all want to be great and they all want to be virtuosos. It's just that path to the piano competition. I feel like this is more normal, more balanced. It kind of weaves together history, it weaves together all kinds of repertoire, and I think more people should explore at least accompaniment and ensemble playing. I think that's a very good thing. Now, big question I forgot to ask you. This is a very big one, and I like to ask people this question, which is, being a composer, being an improviser, knowing partimento, has that changed how you play repertoire?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just with the aforementioned freedom to alter things that are detracting from the musical product. In that particular case, the arpeggio, the way it was voiced at the end of the Schumann Opus 73, that was just completely a poor fit for my hand size. Of course, Clara had very large hands. You can see them in photos of her. So I looked at that, and after the first couple times, I said, this is just not something that works for my hand size. And I had the freedom to go there and revoice it in a way that was true to Schumann's musical intentions and still sounded like a coherent musical whole, because then I speak that tonal language.
Right.
And so I was able to do that. Or I've had, especially in orchestral reductions, I mean, goodness, this is a whole art among accompanists, changing what is on the page to make it sound like the orchestra and be playable. And I mean, that's why I started the accessible accompaniments, because I knew singers would be in these situations where they just had to hand a score to an audition pianist who may or may not know that aria. And it would always be dicey to figure out what are they going to play, especially if it's Strauss, or some of these very thick or very poorly made reductions. And so it was actually, the first one I did was the composer aria from Ariadne auf Naxos, which is a very messy reduction, but it can be reduced down and be pretty playable. And it was for a student of Patricia Stiles, who's a mezzo, who sang that role. And so, seeing that endorsement from her kind of inspired me to continue. And now I have, a growing catalog of these, even some performing auditions and some audition cuts where, it might almost be an aria, but there are a few other people that you can't account for in an audition or solo recital. And so I've started doing the audition cuts.
Hmm.
And but really, I think my life as a composer, improviser, partimento practitioner really equipped me well to start creating these. And so I've heard they've saved a lot of behinds, and I mean, including
Great.
my own.